Hello everyone, and welcome back to episode 2 of the Aerospace Research Collective. And today we're going to hit some more basic milestones and get ourselves some more advanced equipment to move us further along into the game. Our first goal here today is going to be to complete the Orbit Kerbin contract. We had that contract last episode and we weren't quite able to do it. We still don't quite have the parts that we need, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to launch our same craft from the last episode with a few minor modifications. So we're going to add a heat shield and a barometer. Now the launch pad still has a limit of 18 tons, so we are going to have to turn the fuel down a bit more than we did the last time. I noticed while we were on the launch pad that we have some milestones for doing a flyby of the sun. Not quite sure how that's possible, but hey, free money for me. Now we're actually going to launch this craft to the north to try to get another spread out of biome-specific science, especially with the barometer that we just unlocked. Now this time we managed to get this rocket up to an apoapsis of about 98 kilometers. We've also picked up a lot of data from running the atmospheric pressure scan. Since we have a transmitter, we can transmit some of that science back to the ground once we're in space to make room for some of the other science in low space around Kerbin that we haven't collected just yet. I also made sure to transfer the sample from the mystery goo into the cockpit as soon as possible this time to make sure that we got all of the science out of it from space that we could. Now once I felt it was appropriate, I separated the capsule from the rest of the ship. Now after what happened last time, I was quite nervous when I was starting the re-entry with this craft. Luckily, our fancy new heat shield seem to be able to handle everything, and as you can see, we managed to get the pod down with all of the instruments intact. And once we splash down, we're just going to let the instruments run until the capsule is out of data space, and we can recover all of our science points. Now, after this flight, I really had to ask myself, what could I change to actually give us the resources necessary to get something into orbit? I decided that I was just going to have to bite the bullet and upgrade the launch pad, which did use almost all of our funds. I actually didn't quite see that before I did it, but I said, you know what? That's the only thing that's going to make this work, and there are some contracts we can pick up to remedy the situation. The first contract we're going to take is to test the 0.625 meter heat shield landed at Kerbin, which will be remarkably easy to complete. We just need to stick a capsule down. We can stick the heat shield right on the top of it, and we can just launch that. And all we have to do is right-click Run Test, and the contract is done. So you can recover the vessel, and we should get all of the funds back since we're recovering it from the launch pad. There is a contract to cross the radiation belt, but that should logically wait till after we have gotten into orbit. So next we're going to take the contract to haul this Mark 12 radial mount drogue chute into flight. And with our little bit extra funds and our upgraded launch pad, we're going to try to build a vessel that can get into orbit. It's going to have 2 solid rocket booster lower stages and a liquid fuel upper stage. We're going to have all of the same experiments as last time because we still need to run pretty much all of the instruments we have unlocked in space. There's still a little bit of science that we have not yet collected. Now, since we are tight on funds, I did not actually upgrade the data storage in the cockpit, and I removed the monoprop fuel cell that comes in the pod to reduce some of the mass and cost. Now, the radial drogue chute for that contract is actually just going on one of the solid rocket booster stages, and we should be in that stage during the flight when we meet all of the criteria for the part test contract. Now on launch, this rocket was actually getting quite floppy, which is one of the physics limitations of KSP. I tried to check if I could put the auto strut on some of the boosters, but I assume that that is locked behind the tech that actually gives you struts. I checked back later and I did actually have the advanced tweakables toggle on, but for some reason I didn't yet have the ability to use the auto strut. This craft was still manageable though, and we don't have to be super precise on our inclination or heading, since all we want to do is to try to get into orbit. All right, once the second solid rocket stage was expended, we had an apoapsis up to about 60 kilometers. Now, the orbital velocity in low Kerbin orbit in JNSQ is roughly 3,900 meters per second. So if you compare our current orbital speed on the nav ball in the center with the delta V of our stage in the bottom left, you can see that we should have enough fuel left to get into orbit. I did manage the throttle manually somewhat through here, but eventually I got the apoapsis up to about 85 kilometers. I then cut the engines and just coasted to the highest point in our trajectory. And after a short burn, we should be in a stable orbit. And we can see that we have completed the contracts for the hauling of the drogue chute into flight, as well as achieving orbit. Now, while we're up here, we can take as much time as we would like to complete all of our experiments. Luckily, that's not a whole lot of time though, since the capsule is actually running low on electric charge. We don't have any batteries unlocked or any other methods of getting power other than the engine alternator. So we're actually going to deorbit, and while I'm deorbiting, we actually have to do a weird little maneuver where we just burn off the rest of the fuel in the craft just to try to get some electrical charge from that alternator into the pod. We managed to get enough electrical power though to keep the pod stable throughout the descent. Now, after recovering the science from that mission, we're actually just about 1 science point short of the basic science tech. We can take the press mat barometer that we just used for the first time in our last craft, and we can stick it on a pod with an antenna, and we can actually run the pressure scan for the Kerbin lowlands landed situation, and that will give us just enough science to unlock the tech that we want. This tech is very exciting because it has some SCANsat telescopes in it. It has some better data transmitters. We also get the materials bay, the sample collection box, I don't know what you want to call it, as well as batteries and fuel cells, very importantly. Now, the next set of contracts that I picked up are the cross-belt contract. The cross-belt contract would require us to cross into the inner radiation belt of Kerbin. And we also have a contract available to transmit scientific data from Kerbin. This is helpful because the inner belt of the radiation is actually a distinct situation where we can run the Geiger counter experiment. So if we get a craft with a Geiger counter on it that can cross into the radiation belt, that should complete both of those contracts. I did make a little craft with a pod, the materials bay, and some batteries to actually just run that experiment for the Kerbin landed situation, since that doesn't cost anything and nets us a couple science points. And then I went into the VAB to actually build a craft to get across the radiation belt. Now, at first I actually wanted to use a probe for this, but I find that it's just aerodynamically impractical to ever use the Stay Putnik, so After a bunch of launch failures, I decided that I was just going to stick with a normal pod. This rocket is basically going to be the same as the orbiter, but a little bit beefed up with some of the new parts that we've unlocked. Notably, the upper stage is beefier, and it also has the materials bay. We've also included the sample holder part with the capsule, which means we don't have to worry about bringing any of the science instruments home. And the only thing we have to worry about recovering is the pod itself. We'll also be using the fuel cell that we just unlocked. With the addition of a hydrogen-oxygen fuel cell, the ship should actually have electric charge for the entirety of its mission, and we don't have to worry about messing around with burning the rocket engine to try to get a little bit of electrical power. I find that with this set of mods, the fuel cell is actually somewhat useful in the early game, since you don't have access to solar panels. It also has a pretty decent energy density, all things considered. The fuel cell will generate water, but this mission isn't going to be long enough for the water generation to have that much of an impact for us. And with the upper stage almost empty, we managed to get this into an orbit with an apoapsis of about 660 kilometers, which should be inside the inner radiation belt, and a periapsis that is just above the atmosphere. Now, the reason that I wanted to use a probe for this is that, well, Jeb is going to get a little bit zapped while he's in that radiation. But I think we all know that Jeb would be willing to give up a couple years of his life for 2.4 science points. With our radiation scan from the inner belt transmitted, we have completed both the cross-belt contract as well as a contract we picked up alongside that to transmit some scientific data from Kerbin. Now with Jeb recovered, we can successfully say we've achieved a couple of big milestones in this episode. We got to orbit for the first time, and we crossed into one of the radiation belts. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned to see what we get up to next.